When Hitler's publicist told him to change his mustache, Hitler replied, "If it is not the fashion now, it will be later, because I wear it." After World War II, essentially no one has ever been seen using that mustache style again. But to unravel the growing force hidden behind strange follicles, we have to understand how we ended up like this. The post-war era emerged as a golden age for broadcast media. The television was sold at scale, becoming very popular, and we collectively discovered that looking at videos was way more engaging than flipping through a newspaper. In the US, broadcasters were required to serve the public interest by the Communication Act of 1934, but some were still a bit worried. Television networks would have a lot of power to influence public opinion. So, in 1949, the fairness policy was implemented. It required broadcasters to air contrasting views when discussing matters of public interest. If you wanted to debate that cats were better than dogs, you needed a dog person on the other side. This contributed to the shaping of a historical period where television made an effort to present news and debates in a dispassionate fashion, appealing more to rationality than emotions.
Good evening, Vice President Nixon.
Good evening, Mr. Howe.
And good evening, Senator Kennedy.
Good evening, Mr. Howe.
Now let me read the rules and conditions under which the candidates themselves have agreed to proceed.
The fairness policy was an example of how history repeats itself. Since, decades before, when the radio became popular, there was a similar scare, but ultimately resulted in a policy called the Equal Time Rule. Broadcast stations must provide equivalent access to competing political candidates. The fairness policy was eventually repealed under the Ronald Reagan administration, but the Equal Time Rule still holds to this day. In the midst of these times, Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman were likely generating the first appendices of the ideas that led them to write the book Manufacturing Consent. Manufacturing Consent presented a critical perspective on mass media. Chomsky and Herman contended that, contrary to assertions of independence, traditional media performed a propaganda function for the state and the elites. Every country had engaged in a bit of friendly propaganda during the war, censoring bad news and highlighting the positive. But the main thesis of manufacturing consent was different. Chomsky and Herman didn't argue that the state directly censored information, nor that there was a crooked cabal working in the shadows lying to the public, but more simply that, in our current system, media companies would always be incentivized by market forces to support the status quo. Their reasoning can actually be summarized quite simply. Only rich people possess the initial capital to acquire controlling shares or create from scratch large media companies. Second, news media companies are reliant on advertising for profit, so they tend to align with the political and economic preferences of their advertisers, that are another bunch of rich fellows. And then, established news organizations want to project an image of objectivity and avoid legal entanglements. So they commonly use government statements or corporate press releases to, make the news. In fact, these can be portrayed as being presumptively accurate, and are considerably cheaper than engaging in investigative journalism. Chomsky and Herman's conclusion was that, because of these and other systemic forces, large news organizations are incentivized to say what big corporation and the government want them to say. Where there is elite consensus, the media will serve elite interests. Radical or subversive views will be kept out of the mainstream. Was legacy media really this far gone? Not everybody agreed. Manufacturing consent sparked hot debates on whether journalism was genuinely as compromised as Chomsky and Herman portrayed it.
How can you know that I'm self-censoring? How can you know that
you're
journalists
self-censoring. I'm sure you believe everything you're saying. But what I'm saying is if you believe something different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting.
Nevertheless, Chomsky would go as far as to argue that the corporate stranglehold on the media contributed to make the two major American parties look nearly indistinguishable.
We only have one political party with two factions. It's the business party.
In popular culture, these ideas were reflected in jokes about there being a uniparty, or how voting didn't matter.
It's time someone had the courage to stand up and say, I'm against those things that everybody hates. Now, I respect my opponent. I think he's a good man. But quite frankly, I agree with everything he just said.
These are the candidates? They sound like clones. Wait a minute. They are clones.
But a disruptive force was on the horizon. The Internet. In the preface to the second edition of Manufacturing Consent, Chomsky and Herman expressed some amount of hope that a better use of the Internet could lead to major political and social successes. How very sweet of them.
Well, imagine my shock!
While the Internet in a way did provide a voice to everyone, it soon became clear that in the information sphere, rather than watching an MIT university course for free, it was the ravings of magnetic lunatics that managed to transfix the gaze of humanity the most. Contrary to large media companies, the web has practically zero barriers to entry, and no equal time rule, no fairness doctrine or adherence to a journalistic code of ethics is needed to publish content on it. The host of ideas one can present on the internet is also much broader. Nostalgia for the Soviet Union, forms of white nationalism, weird worship for the children's show My Little Pony. At the start it was the actual Wild West, but even now there are sharing platforms that will accept content that falls squarely out of the mainstream. In summation, the most important factor to have your voice heard on the internet is 1. Engagement. In fact, engagement, not truth, is what the algorithms are designed to maximize. The favour of the algo gods is thus garnered with bombastic acts, a good dose of charisma, and simple messaging that doesn't take too much time to process. As Shakespeare used to say,
brevity is the soul of wit.
If one makes a video essay, there better be some jokes, a goofy voice and some memey language to keep the attention high. Otherwise the content will see less eyeballs than my nephew's elementary high school play. This created a system that disincentivized content that reflected on matters in a methodical manner, requiring some amount of effort to follow, while captivated individuals could ramble along, exploiting the biases in human cognition with no one there to contradict them. We saw the rise of divisive conflict entrepreneurs, who were not manufacturing consent, but outrage, that, by the way, paid better. And it's likely no coincidence that during this period, we increasingly started getting informed by comedians rather than journalists. If, for Chomsky, the old media landscape incentivized the production of news that favored the elites, the internet incentivized the immediate subversive messaging of the unbridled charismatic. A technology that seemed poised to decentralize power, in a weird way seemed to centralize it towards individuals with the most ruthlessly engaging forms of communication. No commitment to the truth were required. And so, through time, as more and more people started getting their news through Facebook or Instagram, a silent tectonic shift in the information space was occurring. It is at this point of our story that funny haircuts come in. In fact, what do politicians with strange haircuts have in common? Well, they're gutsy. I mean, it takes real courage to go about your day with hair that looks like this. In short, they have something big that begins with P. No, not that. They have personality. And while in traditional media avenues, politicians were expected to act becomingly of their role, in the service of the public interest, having a bombastic personality is exactly what is needed to succeed in the freer pastures of the new media landscape.
Ministerio de Obras Públicas, afuera, aunque te resistas.
If you combine this factor with a heavy dislike for the nebulous elites, who, according to Chomsky, had the old media in their grip, the questionable haircut politicians suddenly gave a bunch of voters what they had seemingly been denied all along. Normal language, simple explanations, a subversive goal, and a guy you could grab a beer with to vote for. Add into the mix the 2008 crisis, increasing wealth inequality, and the rise of globalism that left manufacturing workers disenfranchised, and the rise of populism was upon us. The populists are funny, persuasive, and full of fighting spirit. Some of them seemingly utilized left-wing ideals, others right-wing ones, and others still adopted syncretic political positions that mixed typically right-wing and left-wing politics. Other than dividing the country in the good people versus the evil elites, it's not really a commonality in policy that unites the populists, but more their rebellious rhetoric and histrionic psychological profiles, that, by the way, made everyone share their content in the new information landscape. No fairness policy or equal time principle applied here. But along with the entertainment factor came other aspects. Populists, possibly in an effort to pander to voters with less training in systematic reflection skills, have often downplayed the role of technical expertise, peddling quick and easy solutions for complex problems. And, perhaps due to their simplified black and white view of the world, they have tended to implement policies that may have hurt their own voter base. Brexit, the Argentina debt crisis, and Trump's tax cuts for the rich come to mind. These occurrences leave some doubts on whether the populist charisma may come at the expense of competence. And this is basically where we find ourselves now, wondering about the relation between information and democracy. Generally speaking, in a democracy, citizens should be appropriately informed to allow for the intelligent discharge of their political responsibilities. So how they are informed is of crucial importance. We had been warned by some that democracy had flaws that could be exploited. How do people call those guys again? Oh yes, the fathers of Western thought. But we didn't really take the issue too seriously, since we designed some public squares that incentivize exactly the rhetorical appeals that in large quantities can overcome rational faculties, ethos and pathos. So we are now left facing some hard questions. What is the appropriate way of informing the public in a modern democratic society? Is the monetization method behind internet platforms to blame for our current situation? Should we train experts to be more charismatic? Here's a radical one. Are the elites really as self-interested and evil as we imagine them? And with these doubts and thoughts I leave you. Thanks for watching. The essay you just viewed was an opinion piece that delved into one of the numerous purported causes behind the rise of populism, specifically the transformation of the information landscape. The strange haircut angle was simply a humorous way to present things. There is evidence for the information explanation, like the fact that the spread of internet availability has been linked to increased support for populist movements, or that in the 2016 presidential election, micro-targeted ads reduced the turnout among Clinton supporters, whereas they increased the turnout for Trump among moderates and less informed voters. While personality has long played a crucial role in politics, our utilization of new technologies may have heightened its significance, potentially at the expense of qualities such as competence and intelligence. In any case, it's important to keep in mind that the rise of populism is a complex phenomenon that is not yet fully understood. Other variables have been brought forth to explain it, like globalism, the financial crisis of 2008, and the possible failure of non-populist parties to represent sectors of the electorate. Video essays are opinions of a dude with a computer, so beware and look at the linked research if you have time.